Howdy of you delicious people. I am here today to review Disney's Jungle Cruise. So I finally went out of my way to watch this film. And, I gotta say, really, one, this movie has to rest on the fact that it has a ride to have already, made people interested about this movie because they're like, oh yeah, I went on Disney's Jungle Cruise and man was that great, and so I hope this movie is just as good as the adventure of which that I had. Really, that's like the expansion of hey, we really just have to make a movie out of a ride, so that way eventually people will be desperate, much more so, to go onto Jungle Cruise. If people aren't interested enough in the Jungle Cruise, we can just make a movie with Dwayne the Rock Johnson to promote this thing. So going into this film, I would just say that this movie is so freaking random, but it has a lot of the same old stuff. Basically, there is so much of a feel in here where I'm like, Pirates of the Caribbean, familiar territory here, familiar territory there. It just kind of feels like we have to go and do if you watch the Dwayne the Rock Johnson movie, The Rundown, it kind of feels like we're going into the same kind of run of that, but it's kind of in an old fashionedly tale of the right around the 1900s, 1912 or something like that. And so we also have to have Dwayne's character that has to have some unique thing to him. It just can't be that he's a skipper on this jungle cruise, because like where's the fun in that? But yeah, so this movie just gets to the point of being far too random, and it doesn't have a really good payoff at the end of this movie. It just feels like the story just wanted to just do something to put a product out there, but really just turns around and is just like, well, the whole payoff of this movie was the adventure. And I'm like, no, the payoff should have been that you should have left with something and then would have became a bajillionaire if you weren't already, or just been able to send people to this one location to eventually get more of this whatever thing, um, because you know exactly where it is now. That would be my thought process. But there is also a cluster of swerves that is to be had with this movie. We just continue to find out that Dwayne is to make us go through this story, and then all of a sudden there's to be this, oh, well, I guess, Dwayne had outsmarted us upon this film, or oh, he has outsmarted us upon this, and then just becomes a lot of that where Dwayne just has to be, I guess, the smartest person compared to Lily, or just compared to anybody. Because if he's not always the smartest person, then he also has another thing up his sleeve, let's just say, that is to just make him, I guess, better than everyone else in this movie, which I'm like, okay, I can just be fine with that just because they can, there has to be a reason why Dwayne has to be in this movie, and Dwayne has to be doing something different enough in this film to garner his interest, which I can understand, into doing this role. So, and plus, there also has to be some kind of surprises for this movie to behold. For you to just oh my god, I didn't think that this would happen in this movie, but then, whoa, swerve come. And then it's oh, okay, alright, okay. So, plus also, this seems kind of close to the movie TMNT. If you go and watch the movie TMNT and then you watch this movie, it kind of feels like a run of the same. Like it kind of is just like we have the exact same thing coming from that animated movie compared to Jungle Cruise. Like it kind of feels like one of the same kind of story, and that's where I was just kind of like, okay, this is just dumb. Um, I would say that this is like it's probably going to be worth a lot of people's time to just kill to watch this movie. I would say that this movie is just an okay piece at best, probably. Because I don't feel like I'm ever going to watch this movie ever again after this point. So that's perfectly okay, because at the end of the day, at least I saw this. This also gave me a ton of vibes of like Legend of Tarzan without Samuel L. Jackson, sadly enough. Because it's just an old fashioned tale, seemingly about a story as old as time, and there's some barely action moments in this movie. It's all about just solving some puzzle, and eventually, like the Legend of Tarzan, also has quite a bit of some kind of boat part that looks quasi similar to to the boat that's in this movie. So it kind of feels like similar in ways, but uh, Legend of Tarzan actually had a lot more action sequences. Overall, just kind of felt like they were trying to create something different with the Tarzan character, where Jungle Cruise was just a lot of just seemingly the same thing. And just surprises! Woo, surprises. Any of these surprises that were happening, like, cute. Like, I was nothing. I was never impressed by this movie. Like I was just never like at a point where I just was to be like, oh, this like to me like the whole thing was like this is the story. Okay, like I was just okay with it. So with that said, I think that's all I wanted to say about Jungle Cruise in a very cryptic like sense. Let's get into this movie in a spoiler like sense. Let's dust out the double five because it's otherwise that time again to probably just go into this movie and talk about it in the best spoiler sense that I can because there's a lot of like farting juicy things about this movie where I'm just like god they have to just like there's so much crap that's just pushed into this movie that also feels like Black Panther and so we basically have a Black Panther plot in this film. So let's get into it. So let's go out of our way to say that we saw this movie because we technically did, but this movie is freaking confusing anyways because there's too much dissect in here. There's too much crap in this movie, and none of it is to be anything like they jump all over the goddamn place, and that's the thing that ticked me off the most. Is I'm just like, what is even going on in this film? What is even this film anymore? Like I'm so freaking confused. Like I felt like I would have to watch this movie 10 times, which I would never want to do, to try and understand everything because they talk about some tree or Tears of the Moon or some other goofy thing that doesn't make any sense to me. They talk about I think like a conquistador that is to go and try to take people thing from them to try to it's just such a weird goofy story. Let's go into it. Let's go into that double five. Let's just go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this movie. So they like build this movie up, but I'm just like I am so like, why is it that all of a sudden we have all these conquistador characters all of a sudden turning into like people that have snakes and bees and all kinds of crap all over them? Pirates of the Caribbean. Copy and paste, pretty much. So, uh, so we have Agir, I believe his name is. Agir, who is to have supposedly been this conquistador, who was to try to go into the Amazon uh, islands to desperately try to find this plant that is from this tree, that is from the tears of the moon, whenever that is to have an event that is to happen. So uh, Akir is to desperately try to go and find this plant, which we find out later. It's to try and help a sick family member of his. And so he is to eventually go on to eventually end up uh, eventually getting killed, or so we are led to believe, but really he just ends up actually not actually getting killed. He ends up eventually just being trapped into this jungle for a very long-winded time until he could eventually get free. But the whole getting free part is not really explained either. It's just like, oh well, I don't know how they got free, but I guess they just got free. Of course they did. So, uh, so eventually it seems that one of these people had eventually brought a map back of this whole location, and so this story had gone around, but not gone around far enough for anybody to actually want to go and find this flower that is upon this tree from the tears of the moon. So that is to lead all of a sudden Lily going and using her brother to try and to put this speech together that she had wrote, because she knows every word of this speech because she is saying every word of it, while her brother is also saying every word of it to all these men, because I guess no one will take a woman seriously for going and doing this presentation, even though she knows what she's talking about. But she has to forcibly use her brother to eventually try and get these men to fund her expedition, which eventually, once they are to talk further about this whole expedition, that's when, of course, this guy is to fold and is to, of course, not know what he's talking about, because all he had the notes for were just for this speech, and that was it. So when they start asking him questions and he started to mention, it's like, well, because they're trying to think of like, well, what would be the applications of getting this flower? And so he just goes off and he's just like, well, it's to cure fevers, like fever, and all these goofy, because he's just like scrambling his notes. He has nothing to really say. So while that's going on, we have Lily, who is to be scrambling to go and go through this location and eventually start to try and find things that she needs, like the map, and eventually she is to have this arrowhead on her. So eventually that is to lead to have Lily just go like, well, I have the money, I'll freaking do this expedition if they're not going to fund this whole thing. So now Lily is just to go on and decide to use Dwayne's uh like ship as a help. And so, and I'm kind of like, I'm going and reviewing this in a roundabout way because I just didn't really have much of an enjoyment for this movie. I just didn't. So, uh, so we end up having Dwayne, who is to be this skipper of course, this jungle cruise. So we have basically the whole time that Frank Wolf's character, who is Dwayne The Rock Johnson, is to go through this cruise and to mention how he is the cheapest jungle cruise out of everyone, and that like basically these people are to pretty much put up forcibly with the experience of Frank Wolf's character, because he is to basically put up crappy jokes, like dad jokes, the whole entire time. Like mentioning how there is to be one snake that is to have an absurd amount of digestion upon him. So like he makes the joke, it's like, well, like that snake might be hard to swallow for some people. It's like, and so we just have these consistent jokes going on and all these fake events that are to happen where like supposedly things that are to scare people or whichever aren't really actually scaring people. And plus, also, there's a point when Wolf is to just have to fix his boat, and people aren't actually getting a cruise. They're getting, like, just Dwayne just kind of going through here and just kind of just fixing his boat. And then on top of that, just going and showing people basically nothing. Like, we have where, like, he used to show him or he used to show them like water falling, and it's just like, ooh, how exciting, like everyone take a picture of this water falling backwards, like isn't that great? It's like, no. But eventually there is to be these tribal characters that are to supposedly hit onto Wolf's boat, which again, I'm assuming that is all to be a facade to give some people an excitement on this cruise because they're just looking at boatloads of nothing. Uh, there isn't any unique things that are to come out of this cruise or whatever, so people are almost wanting to really just be tempted to just get their money back or just to never go on this cruise because what are they really going to get out of this? Bubkiss nothing. So Dwayne is to eventually just be this kind of like rude esh of a guy, um, but he does that on purpose because really it's just like, hey man, you bought like the cheapest experience you can possibly get, so you got your money's worth, you got the cheapest thing that you could find. So what is to happen next is that we have a guy who is called Nilo who is to basically want money from Frank, like $5,000 worth. And so Nilo is to take Frank's engine and hold it for a week because Nilo wants his money. So Frank is to eventually go into Nilo's office, and coincidentally, Lily is to be there, because Frank was going and trying to open this one spot to try and I think get his key for his engine back, or to get his key to unlock the engine so he can kind of take it from Nilo without him knowing. Lily is to kind of break through the door and offer what she's assuming to be Nilo a substantial amount of money to go with her on this cruise. And it seems that Wolf is to probably be the only one out of everyone who is to know how to get to where Lily is to want to go. And so Lily is to talk about the tears of the moon and to talk about the flower and everything like that. And Frank is just to like tell her it's like you're probably going to turn back at some point. Like at some point there's going to be something that is eventually going to make you want to turn back. So like, hey, I'll take your money and that'll be great and all, but eventually you're not going to get as far as you think that you will because something's going to happen and you're going to want to turn back. So Lily is to see that there was to be a screwdriver in this locking mechanism, and Frank is to mention that he lost his key for that. So Lily is to open that thing up, and so eventually we have both Frank and Lily going down the stairs to eventually find that Nilo is to be with Lily's brother, and supposedly Nilo is asking for like $50,000, where Frank is roughly asking for around like $10,000. 5,000 will probably end up being for his engines, that way he can buy that back, and then the other portion of money will probably be for him to eat, and probably also for another thing to eat, which we'll bring up in a little bit here. So Frank all of a sudden is to have a leopard of a thing appear, and so all of a sudden Frank is fighting this thing off, and he's putting on a pretty good show. He's freaking wrestling this thing, no one else is, and so eventually Frank is to toss this thing of meat out the window, and the animal is to run off. So basically, Frank is called a hero. Like, maybe he's gonna get a free drink out of this because of him saving everyone. So I guess that just garners to say that Lily should like hire Frank because he is to be a hero, compared to Nilo, who just runs off because he's like, I'm not going to hassle with that. So eventually, Lily is to eventually offer Frank $12,000, half now and then half when they get there. So they end up going upon this cruise, and so eventually we end up having these characters where Lily is to kind of control everything, and Frank is to consistently call Lily like pants, because she's the only woman to seemingly ever wear trousers or pants, because seemingly every other woman is to wear a skirt. So since she's the only woman that stands out here, Frank is to consistently mention that this girl's to wear pants or trousers or whichever. And then sometimes she has pants underneath her pants for whatever freaking reason. So Lily is to have a brother that seems a lot more like her sister, but then eventually we'll find out that, like, it seems that this man was supposed to be married to a woman, but wanted to pursue other things, let's just say. Um, no offense to, like, freaking, like, I guess that was an interesting thing to put together to write or whatever. Um, I don't know, it's just like, okay, sure, like, whatever you guys want to do. Like, we had Lily's brother who had all of this luggage, like billions upon billions of things of luggage, and we just saw Frank who's just chucking them all off to the side of the water. I'm like, God, what a waste of time that this is. Like, there was so much about this movie where I felt like they were wasting so much time in this film. Like, there was stuff that really wasn't funny, and it was stuff that obviously just felt like, man, you guys really just needed to just waste some things here. You just really needed to just have fun with this movie, but also there was like, man, they spent a lot of time on this part. They spent a lot of time on this, and so on and so forth. So eventually, Frank is to go on and get his engine and be able to seemingly go off and get the heck out of here. But then eventually, once he is to start going on their way, all of a sudden there is to be this guy with a submarine, because we find out that this guy with this submarine is to be tied seemingly with these conquistadors that are kind of coming in and kind of getting information, or giving this guy information, because he wants to go and use this flower to win this war that he is to be involved in. And so that's his edge upon wanting to kind of follow Lily. This is basically Like, this guy is basically the Christopher Walken character from the Dwayne The Rock Johnson movie, The Rundown, where really just this kind of character is the Christopher Walken character that is to be one, technically a villain, but is to basically just want somebody else to do the dirty work for him, so that way then he can eventually just pull a gun on the person to get the prize at the end of all this, which he doesn't actually get. So, and I don't even actually quite understand what exactly happens to this character at the very end of the movie either, because to me, like, this character didn't really matter. Like, I guess he was just to be a character on here to be goofy or to give us some action sequences when obviously certain conquistador-ish like people weren't able to do a thing until these people were to be getting closer to the part of the actual island of this Tree of Tears thing, whichever, pushing on. So all of a sudden, this submarine is to appear out of nowhere, starting to shoot this Jungle Cruise boat. All of a sudden, there is to be a torpedo making its way to the Jungle Cruise boat. So Dwayne has to like smash through this building with his boat, so that way the torpedo can go and hit some other thing instead of this boat, to eventually just like get out of this whole thing that they're in. So eventually they get away from this submarine to eventually have Frank's character going on and putting tar onto his boat, kissing his boat, and so further on in this movie, we eventually have spots where both Lily and McGregor. Yeah, I guess I should probably get that right? He's gonna go on and do Clifford the Big Red Dog. Good for him. Why? I don't know. Sadly enough. So, he's freaking doing just banger out of the park things. I'm sure, like, hey man, getting some pretty good pay, but, like, just, what are these projects? Anyways, like, I thought that, like, Clifford the Big Red Dog thing was a joke, but I guess it's not, weirdly enough. What do I know? So, people get paid big money. Who cares what the project is, I guess. Um, anyways, pushing on. So, what is to eventually happen is this Prince Joachim or Jochen is to get these bees flying into his sub to tell exactly where these people are to be going. And so that is to consistently be help of him. And so we go into this jungle cruise, and so we see these weird looking dolphin of a characters that I guess is quite rare. Sure. So eventually that leads to having uh, Frank and Lily, who are to eventually go on and have to choose between two sections. One is the safer route, and one is this whitewater rafter route, where Lily is to say, hey, I want to go through the whitewater rafting route, and Wolf is to mention that it's very unsafe, like we shouldn't go that route. And she's like, no, I paid you this money, we're gonna go this route. And so Frank is just like, well, when you get scared and we have to turn back, that's all on you. So eventually there is to be a spot where Frank is to feed these people piranhas. And eventually he is to cook them, and eventually they're like, hey, like, what is that taste? and Frank is to mention, well, it's blood, and they're like, like, I don't know. I think Wolf's character is to consistently try to gross them out, because there was this spot where they were to naturally assume, like, dude, I'm not going to eat a rat, and then like it ends up that they just toss the rat into the water to eventually have piranhas come, and then Dwayne grabs a net to get the piranha, and it's like, no, we're having this, and then he ends up cooking it. So here's the thing, though. So McGregor is this guy who is to basically have all these lavish clothes to the point where he has to wear like a three-piece suit everywhere he's going, and Lily is to ask McGregor, it's like, hey, like, aren't you hot? And then all of a sudden we just see a sequence right after that where he's like, oh my god, my eyes are sweating. Like, everything's sweating. It's like, yeah, stupid. That's because you have like 20 bajillion layers on. And this is a guy that has like a thing of clothing for seemingly every single occasion. Like, hey, he has a dinner jacket. Hey, he has a like a bathing suit. Hey, he has like a suit for like playing tennis. Like, this guy brought out a lot of random things that he didn't actually need. Like, there was these things where he had like tennis rackets and all kinds of random crap, and but I guess that technically makes sense that basically you have to bring your whole entire home with you, because how exactly are you going to afford rent or whichever for any number of things when you're no longer in certain locations anymore? But still, like, you should have minimized exactly all of what you have, because eventually, if you're going to be a consistent person that moves around a lot, like, you should have needed something. Like, maybe this guy should have needed a boat of his own to like keep all of this around him, but instead, like, anyways, pushing on. So they get to the white water rafting part, and so eventually we just get to a spot where it consistently feels like Frank is to really not be paying attention of what he's doing, which kind of makes him a very dangerous guy. Because at the early part of this movie, when they're on the cheapest jungle cruise possible, like, people are to, while Frank is to be like fixing his boat, they're almost to crash, and so Frank like dodges this thing in the last ditch second, and so I guess to like give somebody a, ooh, this was a surprise, or like, ooh, this was a shocking thing. No, this guy was just horrible at what he does. But eventually he has this like rope line to eventually like control where the ship is going to without him actually being like right near the steering wheel of the boat. So Dwayne like gets us to this part where eventually there is to be this huge cliff or waterfall that that is to have upon this boat. So I think we just narrowly missed it, like, uh, but eventually they eventually make their way through this whole 2 day like ship at the, like, they cut their 2 day thing in half by going into this white water rafting thing. So, but eventually we start to see characters eventually at some point barf and whatever, because they're just like, they're probably just so scared or whatever during this trip that eventually Frank is going to forcibly want them to turn back. But Lily's like, no, I'm not going to turn back. Even when I barf, like, I'm not going to turn back. So eventually this leads them further on. And so Dwayne is to go down by some part of the ship to fix something, to find that there is to be this ball coming back at him. And he's like, not right now. And the ball keeps coming back. We end up finding out that that leopard was actually, that Dwayne's character Frank was fighting, was actually his pet and was his favorite pet of all the pets that he's ever had, because he's had a long stretch of pets. So eventually, what is to happen is that Frank is to desperately want Lily's arrowhead that's around her neck. So, because it's a valuable item to him, and so like that's the only reason why he's really going through this cruise, because he thinks that eventually he can go back to this part of this island to eventually get something, which we'll talk about later. So eventually we head further and further into this part of jungle, and so eventually that just leads us to eventually having these tribal members go onto Frank's boat and knock them all out. So they all go and they end up getting captured, and they end up getting pushed onto uh, these whole tribal people. And I know I'm kind of going quick to the draw with this movie, but like there's not a whole heck of a lot going on either. So eventually, we get to a point in here. Sorry if I say that a lot. Uh, the tribal people, like Dwayne, is to speak in their native tongue, and Kazuli is to desperately say, like, "Hey, translate everything that I'm going to say to them so they can understand what I'm saying." And so Frank goes and does the opposite thing of whatever she's saying. That Lily's to mention, like, "Hey, I will give back the arrowhead to you," and Frank is to say that she's being very difficult, and and Lily is uh, and if you save uh, all of us, and Frank is to say, if you only save me, like that'll be fine. And so like he's like telling them the exact different opposite thing of what this person really say. But we end up finding out anyways that all of these tribal people actually speak English. That all of this is another ruse being put together by Frank. And so all of this was all a lie that was to be put together by Frank. And so I'm like, wait a minute, so this guy is to supposedly not have money for his boat or whatever, and so his engine is to be taken, but he has all this ability to put it together all of these hoaxes, all of this crap. I'm like, what is up with that? Like, that doesn't quite make any sense to me. But eventually it will come clear, because eventually, while these people are in this tribal area, and bizarrely McGregor is to get this seemingly tattoo ink upon his face that will seemingly never wash off. And so this guy is just like, well, I'm trying to scrub this off. And Frank is like, yeah, that's tattoo ink. That's never really going to come off until maybe a couple of like years from now or something like that. Like if you keep cleaning enough. So now this guy is to have this makeup on for the rest of the movie, because like they have to keep continuity. Hopefully it works. So eventually we have in here where all of a sudden we have the Pirates of the Caribbean guys coming in, the Aguirre and a lot of his other minions that are to be Bee Guy, and Aguirre is to be Snake Guy, and like we just have a number of guys that have these certain kind of tropes that look Pirates of the Caribbean-esh. So Aguirre comes in here and is to try and take the arrowhead, and so Frank is to eventually try and protect all of these people. And so eventually Frank is to get stabbed in the chest, and then all of a sudden go smacking all the way down this big freaking tree of a thing, and just hit all these branches, and eventually fall to the ground, supposedly dead. And so they're like, oh my god, Frank is dead. Like, oh no, where are we gonna go? How are we gonna go into this jungle cruise now? What's gonna happen? All of this is gonna just come to a scratching halt. Frank is to be dead. Oh no, this is awful. This is so just completely awful, right? No. We find out bizarrely that Frank is an immortal, and that anything of a stab, of a heart or whatever, of a bodily thing, will just have Frank just come back to life. So, Frank has been alive for seemingly 400 years, and so he has spent so much time only being able to go to a certain part of this world because he can only leave a certain part of this island. So, because Frank was tied to the other Pirates of the Caribbean looking guys, the conquistadors, or and he was tied to them because, like, basically, Frank and Aguirre were basically brothers, and so Frank is to know the story of Aguirre and why he had to go off to help, I think, his daughter, because his daughter was sick, to go and get this flower. So eventually, once these people were to eventually make it to this island and to try to get this flower, eventually they started killing people. And Frank had decided that he did not want part of these guys going and killing off all these people. So Frank, trying to save some of these tribal people, and that just led to this tribal priest person um, to eventually go on and curse all of these men, which eventually leads the conquistadors, the Aguirre, and a lot of his men to eventually be stuck like statues because the forest, I guess, would supposedly defend itself. And like that's a big part of the movie, that the forest at some point in time would figure out ways to defend its own self. And so that's what lands us into this part where these branches and trees and stuff like that were to grab these conquistadors and like stick them against this wall and then turn them to stone bizarrely, like as if they were like Medusa had seen them. So uh, because Frank had decided to drop them into this cave because they were to all eventually be cursed to like seemingly live forever. But then eventually Frank had found a way to turn them all into stone to just kind of keep them there for X amount of time. And so eventually, for some reason, now they are to have been reawakened. I guess because someone has the arrowhead nearby, and like somebody's going, like, I guess maybe the whole Tears of the Moon thing, this whole like ceremony moment thing has reawakened these people to eventually go after this whole thing. And I know this is a roundabout way. I know this movie might not be exact accuracy of what I'm talking, but I'm doing it in a ballpark way. Freaking, like, this movie is jumbled all over the goddamn place, in all honesty. So, let me pause for here for a second. Let me reset. Anyways, this movie isn't complicated enough. So, Frank had been alive for a number of hundreds of years, like I'd said. So, you can kind of see, like, time for him has, like, there's a montage of, like, seemingly time, like, where a town has been built and Frank has been alive seemingly forever, and that like things have changed while he's been alive. So Frank is to eventually want to go back to this place, considering Lily is going there anyways. Frank wants to go back to hope that the curse is to be finally be broken, and so that way he can go back and be moral once again, and so that way he can leave this island finally and be able to go off and live a life and not have to be like worried that he's still going to outlive everyone. So eventually we go off and we have McGregor, who is to eventually go with the submarine guy and eventually be like, no, wait. Because eventually what ends up happening is like McGregor is to be left with the tribal people because I think he ended up twisting his leg. But eventually McGregor is to kind of take this boat with this one tribal girl for eventually this submarine to just kind of like pick up his boat with him on it, so that way forcing this guy to go on the submarine to see where these people are to still go. But McGregor is not to really give out much of information. But either way, this guy is to hold McGregor because, excuse me, I apologize for that. Because really he's just a bargaining chip to basically just be like, well, if you won't give me what I want, then I will kill your brother. Uh, like, basically, that's what it really comes down to. We have the tribal girl who ends up basically just jumping off the boat and swimming her way back to where she had been. Because, like, dude, I'm not freaking, like, I'm not risking my life for anybody. So, that leaves Frank and Lily to be by themselves. And basically there seems to be such a very close moment of them almost like kissing or having this romantic relationship, especially when Frank is to tell her his whole backstory. But also, once we are to find out that The Rock is immortal, or Dwayne is immortal, or Frank is immortal, they have to take a severely long time to just pull this sword out of Frank's chest. Like, we have this whole thing where Frank is to ask Lily, it's like, well, technically you're a doctor, right? So you should be able to pull this sword out of my chest. And Lily's like, well, I'm not that kind of doctor. But so Lily is to like try and start to take the sword out, and Frank is like, hey, don't pull that way. That freaking hurts. Like, well, doesn't it hurt to have this sword in your body? Like, I don't know about pain threshold, but like I don't know. So eventually they're taking forever, but eventually the sword does eventually come out of Frank's chest, and then they're like, oh, okay, on to the next thing because we took enough time to joke about the whole sword through the chest thing. And McGregor was weirdly talking about that maybe he should like do something from the back, like from behind the Rock, and just kind of help maybe the sword like go through or some goofy thing where it just seems like some weird, bizarre innuendo that seemed freaking weird. So, but yeah, so pushing on. So, eventually, both Frank and Lily are to eventually make it to the spot where seemingly it is close to them finding this flower thing that is to be coming upon this tree. But eventually, once they do that, they eventually arrive there to eventually be just to be thwarted by this submarine guy who's to appear right in front of them and is to basically just now like shoot a gun around them and to sing this goofy song to want to consistently force them to try and get them to the next piece of this bizarrish puzzle of things. There was also a moment where both Frank and Lily had to go and do this one water mission, and Lily can't swim. And so Lily has to go and figure out this whole puzzle, and Dwayne, or The Rock, or Frank has to consistently go down, giving her air to eventually have her figure out this whole puzzle. And eventually she is to almost drown, but then Frank is to revive her by just like pushing her body all over, not really giving CPR. He's just kind of like smacking her and like pushing her body up and down, like for whatever reason, which doesn't feel anywhere like a CPR kind of maneuver. This girl could have already been dead, and Frank is just like, I'll just kind of like slap her arms or slap her face or just see if she wakes up that way. For a person who drowned, just like pump the chest a little bit, see if some water comes pluing out. So they do this whole pushing on. Eventually, they are eventually to get to us getting to the point of the tree that is to give us this magical plant. So there seems to be a ton of the things that are to be planted out for this one special occasion. And so everybody's easily thinking like, hey, I'm gonna get one part of this plant. I'm gonna get one part of this plant. I'm gonna get one part of this plant. Everybody's gonna get one part of it. Like it's freaking Oprah season for everybody in a part of this plant. And so everybody thinks there's gonna get a million of them. So eventually that leads us to eventually actually getting to the part of the plant where the plant is to grow. And so that is when, of course, Agir and his men are to appear and to basically start taking out a bulk of the bizarrish German guys in his regime. And eventually we just get parts where supposedly the jungle is to defend itself. So eventually people are to get killed in the process, or people are just to get like killed. It doesn't really matter. It's not a big thing. It's not a big whoop. So, uh, so eventually, what is to happen is the jungle is to defend itself yet again, to eventually just lead Agir and all of his men to be stuck onto this wall yet again, and also so does Frank, and so all of them end up turning back into these statues. Lily is to eventually get one of these plants or one of these herb things, which I guess would be the technical term of this. I say plants, whichever, this thing that they are to get, this thing that is a waste of time to get. There is bizarrely this consistent handoff that is going once Lily is to get this plant, this thing, and eventually Frank is to have it. And so all of the Pirates of the Caribbean-esque looking guys are to go after Frank, and then they open up his hand to see that it's just a parrot in his hand. So to find out that I believe McGregor is to have the flower. The whole it's bizarre, stupid handoff things going on here, just to like surprise people and just be like, oh, who really cares? Because what eventually happens is that Lily ends up going and touching the statue of Frank, who is now statue etched to this part of this jungle. So she ends up giving the plant to Frank, which I guess is to break the curse of Frank. And then he ends up being unstatued, and all of a sudden that is to break the curse of him to be able to go anywhere that he wants now. Because Lily was to mention to Frank, like, well, we can go to England. We can, like, you can drive a car for the first time, and blah 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 blah. So really, nothing really actually happens out of this. There is no payout at the end of this movie besides adventure, because the other guys don't actually die. There isn't a plant that is to have been brought back to like do anything for anyone. Basically what ends up just happening is McGregor ends up coming back to these old guys and doing this whole like speech all over again, really just kind of the same similar speech, but this time around it's like, well, hey, like this time around we don't give an F about what you guys say. And so, like, we just came here to just tell you that, like now that this thing actually does exist, and now that there actually really is a real story out of this, and it's something that you guys want, we're not actually going to do this for you. You guys need to go and do it yourselves, kind of thing. So, because this guy is to mention all of the things of which that he had seen, and that like all these unique things that they were to have possibly gone if they would have gone through this journey, this jungle cruise. So this guy is to basically just say, like, yeah, you guys go and do your own cruise, you guys go and do your own like expedition. So at the end of this, we just have Ricky really just Frank and Lily just driving off in this automobile, and Frank is to sell off his boat to Nilo because it's technically his boat anyways. So because Frank is to basically no longer need to like do what he does anymore. Like Frank was to almost say that he just wants to die, that he just feels like he's seen everything hundreds and hundreds of times over. But like Lily was to say, it's like, well, but like it, like all of that that you saw like wasn't with somebody. You just did this all on your own, and so like that that probably wouldn't have been as good as doing this all by your own. So eventually Frank is to eventually get in this car, basically drive off, and like that's how this movie is just to finish up. It's basically just saying that Frank is to be free of everything, so I'm sure if they do a sequel, I'm sure they'll just go back and do the exact same thing as they did in the first one, but this time around there'll be bigger stakes, or there'll be some other like little grand prize of a thing that they weren't aware of. And I'm sure it's basically going to be like The Mummy 2, where everything is almost going to be the same, where these people are going to have to be forced back to doing what they were doing. And so I'm assuming that's probably what's going to eventually happen, is there's going to be somebody that's going to force these people back to what they're doing, because I'm assuming there's probably going to be a sequel out of this, because this movie made probably just enough money maybe to make a sequel, garnering whatever, because technically Frank, who's Dwayne, like Dwayne movies tend to make money, but I don't know if they tend to make sequel money, but meh. Anyways, that's all I wanted to say about this movie in a very roundabout way. A lot of people will probably just say it's like, oh, you weren't specific enough. That's completely fine. People will tell me exactly how this movie broke down, and I'll just tell them, why aren't you reviewing this? Why aren't you yourself reviewing this movie that isn't actually all that good? In all actuality, like this is just like a movie that just has a lot of all over the place things, that also is a lot of stuff to just like waste a lot of time, because you're thinking like, oh, like there's something interesting going on here, and then there's this swerve of like, oh, well, Frank had this plan all along of hoaxing all these things to push these two characters back, and that's the real story here. So I'm gonna get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.